share my screen and I will show some slides at the beginning, but the majority of the session will be live coding and showing live demos. I hope you will enjoy that. So my name is Martin Lippert. I work for VMware. I work in the core Spring engineering team. And my day job is to focus on the Spring tools. So my team and myself, we're working on the Spring tools and Spring editions for all the famous IDEs like Eclipse, like Visual Studio Code, Git Pod, Eclipse Thea, and things like that. And today I would like to introduce you to basically two things, really. One side is GitHub Codespaces. And one side and the other side is kind of the technology a little bit behind the hood that you can also leverage to get some benefits out of these ideas behind GitHub Codespaces. So what is GitHub Codespaces? It is a new feature being provided by GitHub, and it is basically, the idea behind that is basically having a cloud-hosted development environment based on Visual Studio Code. So if you know Visual Studio Code, if you use Visual Studio Code locally on your machine, you will see that GitHub Codespaces look pretty familiar to you because it is basically an online hosted version of a Visual Studio Code. At the moment, it is enabled for teams in GitHub Enterprises, so they can, the org admins can enable this, and there's a public beta for individuals. So if you want to use that as an individual, you can apply for the beta. And it is something like, it's of course kind of a commercial offering from GitHub, but we will take a look at some other parts that are non-commercial, of course, as well. So the things that are possible in GitHub Codespaces, and this is why I think this is super interesting, is that if you are familiar with Visual Studio Code running that locally, you will see that you get a lot of extensions, basically. You can enhance that for other languages, other tools, other frameworks. For example, of course, the Spring Boot tools that we built for Visual Studio Code, the Java language support, all the other things. And you will see that you will be able to basically do all this in the online hosted version as well. So you can, it really starts to feel like a regular Visual Studio Code environment with the additional benefit of you're using cloud resources to run all that. And you can access that in the end via a browser. So for example, in the cloud, you can say, I would like to have kind of a hugely sized machine or a small sized machine. You get all the power of the machines in the cloud. And you can still use that from your desktop via browser interface. The nice part about that is, and we will see that in action as well, is that you are not limited to the browser-based interface. Since I know that even though Visual Studio Code is, that's a really lightweight, a really fast editor, and it feels the same if it runs inside a browser-based environment with Codespaces behind the scenes, some people still don't like to code in a browser window because there are some limitations. Some keyboard shortcuts might not work, and you might accidentally close the window if you just want to close your editor tab or things like that. Those things can happen in my live demo as well. So be prepared for that, for those accidents to happen. But the cool part about that is that if you have GitHub Codespaces running, and you have this Codespace running in the cloud that you can access with a browser interface that looks like Visual Studio Code, you can also use your locally installed Visual Studio Code and connect that to the cloud workspace that you have, to the Codespace in the cloud. So it feels like you're working on a locally installed Visual Studio Code, your desktop application, basically. But it is connected and it is using all the cloud resources behind the scenes as kind of a second option to access your Codespace. That is what I think is really nice. And we will see that in action as well. So let me stop talking about slides, because slides are sort of boring when we talk about tools, and switch over to some tooling stuff. So let me move around my crazy Zoom thing here. So what I would like to start with is basically a plain empty GitHub repository as a starting point. So I created my Codespaces Spring Demo public repository, nothing really special, README, git ignore file for Java stuff in there already, nothing else basically. And I would like to get started with a simple Spring Boot project. What can I do? Usually I would go to start.spring.io, of course, and create a project and download that, open my local IDE and things like that. But in case of Codespaces, you can also say, instead of cloning things locally, I go and open a Codespace. In this case, Codespace of this size, 4 core, 8 gigabytes of RAM, machine, that should be enough for my simple demo. So let me just go ahead and create this Codespace. What happens now behind the scenes is that in the cloud, kind of hosted by GitHub, there is this container environment being set up for my coding environment. And this container setup will be prepared to have a Visual Studio Code running and is already connected to my repository where I invoked that a second ago. So what you see here looks like pretty familiar, right? So Visual Studio Code, a plain, simple Visual Studio Code. So let me maybe switch to, I don't know, dark mode because people like that. And I have kind of the get started thing. I have my terminal here. So in the terminal, you will see it is kind of running in the cloud. Some stuff might already be installed by default in the default environment here, but we will talk about that a little bit later. So what I would like to do here is I would like to get started. So what do I need? I need some extensions. So let me grab some extensions that I should really use here. And I would like to use the Java extension. So I install the Java extension pack for Visual Studio Code, includes the language support, the debugger, the Maven support, some nice bits and pieces, and I install that into Codespaces, into this Codespace. So this extension pack will end up in this Codespace, and that's already there. Get some nice getting started thing. That's fine. The other thing I would like to install is the Spring Boot extension pack. So this installs the Spring Boot tools, initializer support, so basically an integration for start.spring.io in my Visual Studio Code IDE. So let me install that as well. So once all this is installed, I will see that there's a nice getting started page being opened up for this as well. And I could start doing stuff now, right? So for example, in this getting started guide, it tells me nicely that I can create a Spring Boot project using the initialize integration. So let me just do that, invoke that. So it invokes the initialize integration in Visual Studio Code running in this Codespace. And it asks me the same questions then start.spring.io would ask me, like the Spring, select the Spring Boot version, the language, the artifact ID. I just use all the defaults showing up there. As packaging as a Java version 17. That sounds like a great choice. And I will select now the starters. So I pick the Spring Web one. I also like the Spring Boot actuators a lot. And I go ahead with that. Where should it go? Into my Codespace. So workspaces, Codespace Spring Demo. That sounds okay. It creates stuff behind the scenes. And then it asks me whether I need to move things around a little bit. It should kind of open the generated project already for me. So let me add that to the workspace that I have. Over here, it shows up. That's my generated project. So I created all this from start.spring.io. Looks like I have some kind of Java application in here, a standard Spring Boot application. So that looks okay-ish. And I can already see that the Java tooling is already kicking in. I can already see, oh, Java as a language is selected. And if you start up the Java support in Visual Studio Code, after you installed it, it usually starts up in a very lightweight mode that kind of starts up super fast, but it only gives you kind of limited features for Java because it does not do all the heavy lifting behind the scenes, like resolving the POM file and downloading all the dependencies and stuff like that for you, since my code space is pretty much empty, right? But I can switch and say, okay, please load the project and please do all the, let's say, all the heavy lifting for me. And if I check the details behind the scenes, you will see some kind of progress report in here, what's going on, downloading dependencies, whatever, building the Maven model, and I can view my Java project over here in this nice browser, this nice view for Java projects in VS Code. It shows me the usual stuff that I think you're all familiar with your regular IDE, like what are all the Maven dependencies, the JRE that's being selected, my resources, tests, and the application. And from here, I can go ahead and do real Java coding in a browser window, which is pretty fluent. Let us do something. Let us create a new file, and because I would like to implement a controller. So I create a new file saying my controller.java. It knows it's a Java class, does all this kind of standard stuff for me. That looks good. I would like to turn this into REST controller. Content just shows up pretty fast. So this is a REST controller. I would like to implement a get mapping. Shows up code snippet that's coming from the Spring tools. Make it easy for me to implement a get mapping in this case. So let's say hello. I don't need that. Return something. Something weird is going on here. My closing brackets are gone. Here we are again. Hello world of JCON-ONLINE. So as you can see, this is really kind of doing the usual Java language tooling, and it's super fast, right? You can really use it inside this browser environment. Unused import, let me do, for example, source code action, organize imports. You see, you really get full-featured Java tooling inside of this browser-based environment. Okay, so I think you will even see in the outline that the Spring tooling is already kicking in and showing me some nice overview about my Spring concepts, the Springy stuff that I have in this project. I could, for example, also execute commands and then search around and take a look what's going on here. For example, I can invoke the command palette in Visual Studio Code and say, let me, I don't know, for example, search for symbols in workspace. Get a nice overview about all my Springy elements, like a get mapping that I've implemented. There's a bean called demo application, the main application. There's another bean called my controller. Pretty simple project, so not a lot of stuff is showing up here, but it gives you a nice overview about all your Springy concepts, which is really behind the scenes the same stuff that you will see and you might already be familiar with when you use Visual Studio Code for Java and Spring development on your desktop machine. So I have that here. The interesting question now is, can I execute that? Can I run that? Of course, but where does it run? So usually in my window here, I can switch over to the other terminal. You know that I'm somewhere in the cloud. So this machine is somewhere in the cloud. So I can run that. I can create, or maybe not create a launch config, but just switch over to the demo application and press run here. There's a little code length showing up because it recognizes that, oh, this is kind of a Java application. I can run it from here. There's a main class. So it makes it easy to run stuff. So let me just run the application, the Spring Boot app. And it runs the Spring Boot app. So that looks fine. That looks nice. It shows me live hovers because the Spring tooling knows about there's a running Spring Boot app. So you started the boot app. It shows you some information from this running boot application inside of my source code. For example, here I can see this bean is being created. This get mapping is active at runtime to allow you to easily see what's going on at runtime with your Spring Boot application. But I would like to try it out. I would like to execute it. So I can, for example, just click on this. And you will see that there is an automated port forwarding being in place for your application. So with this URL here, for example, you will get access to the running thing on your machine that is running on port 8080, as you can see over here. So, which makes it easy for you to just run your application in the cloud, in your dev environment that's running, hosted somewhere. And it automatically ports forward the stuff that the application needs in order to let you try things out. So let me go back here. Of course, I could also say, oh, let me debug things. So I stop the app again. Let me go back here. That's maybe the easiest way to do it. Start debugging. It starts up the app again in debug mode in this case. I will go back to the controller. I will again hit the endpoint over here, port forwarded, and it hits the breakpoint. I can inspect all the stuff and do the usual things like step into and step over and continue to run. And the result is it runs, right? So it really feels like a regular dev environment, but running inside of the cloud, which I think is pretty amazing. So this kind of shows you a little bit that you can really have this environment running inside of a cloud, but you still get great tooling right away that feels like you're working inside of a local environment, right? Performance is fast, content is fast, you get all the language tooling, all the things that you are familiar with. If I would like to take a look at this locally inside of my VS Code, because I told you I can also use that locally if I don't really like this browser-based environment, I can really do that. So if I switch back to, I have my local Visual Studio Code running on my desktop over here, right? Nothing really special about it, nothing really specially installed. I have the remote development extension installed. So if you go to the extensions, so go for remote, you'll see remote containers, for example, remote development is the extension pack for that installs you the capability into your local Visual Studio Code to do remote development. So it allows you basically to run your dev environment somewhere in a container in the cloud, like in the Codespace case, for example, and connect your Visual Studio Code to that. So if I select GitHub Codespaces, it shows me, oh, I have a few Codespaces running. For example, this one over here that we talked about all the time. So I can connect to that. And what happens now, it is basically the same as you've seen in the browser-based environment, locally installed Visual Studio Code, but it is really connecting to the cloud-hosted instance of your dev environment. So when I, for example, when I open a terminal over here, you see, who am I? I am in the code space. I'm in the cloud. So everything that I see now in my Visual Studio Code is really connected to this cloud environment. So of course I can browse this stuff, see the same application, same source code over here. I could run stuff. I will get port forwarding as well to my local machine. I can basically do the same things and get the same environment, but I have the UI of my local installed Visual Studio Code, which I think is pretty cool. The question for me is still, I opened up my project, and what did I do? I started to configure my dev environment, right? I started to install extensions. I started to configure some stuff, switch to dark mode or whatever. I added a few preferences, maybe, installed a specific Java version, things like that. So basically everything that belongs to this project, right? So usually every project has its own kind of dev requirements, like I need this version of Maven, I need this version of the JDK, I need these additional command line tools, I need these specific extensions for my IDE to work with this project, and they need to be configured in a certain way. And most of the time, people really they install everything on their local machine, right? So I install everything locally. I have all the JDKs in the world installed on my laptop. And when I switch between projects, I really have my Visual Studio Code, for example, that contains everything, contains all the extensions, everything that I need for a project. And when there's a new project coming along, I need to find it out. I need to manually configure all the stuff. And more or less the same happened with Codespaces here. But there is some technology behind the scenes that is used by Codespaces that is pretty interesting. And this is called the dev containers. The dev container, it's basically a specification. It's a specification for files, for the dev container JSON file, more or less, that allows you to define and describe the development environment that you need inside of this dev container JSON file. And you can put all the things basically that I talked about a minute ago into this dev container JSON file. So you can say, okay, I would like to have a specific version of the JDK installed. I need these additional tools installed. I need these specific extensions for Visual Studio Code installed. They should be configured in a certain way, and so on. And then you can basically commit this file to the project. And as soon as you commit this file to the project, it becomes part, the description of the environment becomes part of the project itself. So whenever someone would like to use this project, would like to code on this project, they can create, or for example, use Codespaces. And if Codespaces identifies a dev container JSON file inside of the project, it will configure itself with that description. So let's see how that looks like in practice. So I go back to my little sample application over here, my demo application, my controller thing. And what I can do here is I can say, I go to this my quick, quick access to Codespace relevant commands. I could also do the usual command palette and say Codespaces and see all the different actions that I have. And I would like to add a development container configuration file, this dev container JSON file, basically. And it will ask me a few questions to make it easier. So what's the usual thing I would like to do? So I would like to do Java. I would like to use Java 17, the LTS version. I would like to have Maven installed and some other stuff. Maybe not now, so forget about this. And it creates a Docker file where it basically says what is installed in my environment. And it creates this dev container JSON file where it tells me Java variant, but things like that, the stuff that I talked about. But Especially interesting from my point of view is that you can also configure your development environment. So you can say, in this case, it says, okay, there's VS Code. For VS Code, I would like to have these extensions installed in my VS Code. So here, for example, let me add one because I would like to add the Spring Boot tools. And I don't know the ID of that. So I go back to the extensions thing, Spring Boot extension pack. And when you take a look at that and click here, you can copy the extension ID, for example, and then insert that here. And next time I open this in a new code space or someone else, they will get all these extensions installed. And in addition to that, I will also, for example, say, let me configure the launch mode of the Java extension. The stuff that I added in the beginning when I talked about this lightweight mode that the Java tooling is being started with at the beginning, you can educate VS Code to forget about that and directly use the standard mode to get the full-blown features and Java project resolution, downloading Maven dependencies, whatever you need right away, which is kind of the standard mode. You can also say, oh, keep the lightweight mode or do some kind of hybrid thing. Then it starts at the first one, the lightweight one first, and then the other one later. So I define the standard one here. And since I said everything is hooked up, I can already also kind of commit everything that I have here to my GitHub repo. So let me commit and sync the changes. And as you can see, when I go back here, all the stuff is in my GitHub repo, especially not only the code that I generated, but also the dev container specification. So the next time I open this up, it will recreate the same environment for me, which I think is pretty cool. So what we did for this, or before I switch to the other project, I would like to also talk about that this dev container JSON file, this dev container specification, it is really a public specification. So everybody could use it, everybody could benefit from it, everybody could build tools around that. In Visual Studio Code, there's also support for these dev containers. So GitHub Codespaces can use dev containers. As I said, right? You open a code space, it figures out there's a dev container file in the project. So it uses that to build the containers and run them in the cloud. But if you run or if you open up the project locally in your VS Code, forget about Codespaces, forget about a cloud-hosted environment. If you open the project locally in VS Code, it will also ask you saying, oh, there's a dev container JSON file. Should I open up a local container running on Docker for you, installing all the stuff? And allow you to develop against this locally running dev container that contains all the tooling instead of installing everything on my local machine. Instead of that, I get everything installed in my local dev container, which I think is pretty nice. So if we take a look at, let me forget about the port forward here. One of the more famous sample projects, of course, in the Spring universe, the pet cleaning one, you'll see that Dave Sire also added a dev container specification file over here. So if you want to hack against pet cleaning, you would like to try it out in Codespaces or locally in Visual Studio Code without really installing anything beyond the standard regular VS Code thing, you can just do that, right? So in this case, I have one running over here. So as you can see, you get the full tooling, all the stuff for pet cleaning, and you can work on pet cleaning as well. And this is specifically, the Spring tooling shines more with larger projects, of course, because if you do something like go to symbols and workspace and do this, you see all the request mappings of the project, or you can see all the beans that are defined. in pet clinic over here, so I can quickly switch to the pet controller thing. I can run those things over here. So I can run pet clinic, I can debug pet clinic in my code space. I will most likely even see the live hovers that we talked about and that we already saw on my simple example case, as you can see here. So let me go to the welcome controller and open up the welcome page again. Port forwarding is in place. I can, on port 8080, I can use pet clinic over here and run that inside of the Codespace container, but the stuff is forwarded, so I can access that over here. Use all the tooling that I have available, debugging, live hovers, changing code, using all the Java tooling around. In this case, I think Dave even added a configuration to the dev container file that allows you to use Docker and Docker. So you could even go ahead and do crazy stuff like in this Codespace environment running in the cloud, running inside of a container, you can kick off a Maven build and use the Spring Boot integrated feature to build container images as a build result. You can even run that here and deploy them somewhere, for example, if you want to deploy this container somewhere, instead of running things only locally inside of your dev container thing. So let me stop this over here and quickly switch back to my local Visual Studio Code, which is still connected to my sample. So I will probably close that and open up a new window. And as you can see here, if I go back to the Codespaces thing, Spring Project, Spring Pet Clinic, there's a Codespace running already. I could connect to that. Same features, same stuff as I showed before, right? For my other project. But what is also interesting, I have cloned the project locally. So I have the project locally on my disk. So I could use Visual Studio Code as usual on my local machine. But as you can see here below, it is asking me saying, oh, there's a dev container specification file included in this project. Should I open this in a container and connect VSCode to this container environment? So let me do that. So in this case, it reopens VSCode, but it starts up a dev container locally on Docker running on my machine and connects VSCode to this locally running dev container in Docker. It is now, it really feels like the same as what we've seen before, where the development environment is running in the cloud on Codespaces, on the Codespaces infrastructure somewhere. Now, all this environment is running inside of my local Docker on my local machine, but all the stuff that I need for hacking on this project is running inside of this Docker container as well, because it was specified in my dev container file. So I will get all the tooling running. Let me open something here, whatever. I get all the Java project tooling, the Java stuff, the Spring tooling running inside of this Docker file, but I still have kind of the feeling of completely developing locally on this machine, the container environment for all things that are special to my project, and my VS Code locally installed, accessing this container environment and allow me to do all this. I think this is just, I don't know, maybe me guessing around a little bit. But I think this dev container specification file and the concept about describing the environment that you need for a project and contributing this definition into the project is really a game changer moving forward. My assumption is that many projects will adopt it and will incorporate this description into their repos, basically, so that no developer really needs to care about and think about what do I need to install locally to get running with this specific project. This could especially also be interesting for open source projects, right? So if you have a project on GitHub and you would like to make it easy for people to contribute stuff, to run your project, to try it out, why not add a dev container specification file? And people can then, for example, use Visual Studio Code to just get everything installed inside of this dev container, instead of letting them install everything locally with long description and README files saying, oh, please install this version, and please install that, and please run this command, and please do this, and please do that. And then you're ready to go. And oh my God, you have the wrong version of Node installed. That doesn't work with that version. It only works with the other version. Those problems are basically gone if you describe stuff in the dev container specification file. Whether you use that just locally, running stuff in Docker on your machine, or if you jump to the full-featured cloud environment where this container hosting your dev environment is being hosted and run in the cloud for you and managed in the cloud, that's kind of an independent question, really. So you can do basically both. And I think that is it's really cool and a big step forward. And if you would like to learn more about the dev container specification file, you can go to devcontainers.dev. There's a specification and supporting tools and things you can do with it. And my assumption, but that's just me guessing, that more and more people will adopt that and put that into the projects and try things out, as we are trying with the pet clinic thing at the moment as well, and allow people to easily run and develop and hack on pet clinic without really installing anything locally on the machine. Right? So if you would like to know more about that, I put together a few resources, few links. So if you would like to know more about Codespaces itself, the hosted version, you can go to github.com/features/Codespaces. And get information about pricing and about, I think you can also sign up for the beta there, or whatever happens in the future. If you would like to do Java and Spring development inside of this environment, I highly recommend to install basically two main extensions. One is the Java extension pack that we've seen. It includes support for running Java and code assist, refactoring, debugging, testing, Maven, things like that. You can run unit tests. It's nicely displayed. I haven't shown that. Really full-featured Java support. Behind the scenes, interestingly, the Java extension in VSCode uses the Java language engine that is also used by the Eclipse IDE. So it is based on the same core language support, which is really, really sophisticated and provides you tons of content assist and refactoring supports and code actions. And it's always up to date with the latest Java version. So you can even get that running Java 17, Java 18. And I think there's even an early access pack for Java 19 already out there that you can try in Eclipse. And the same engine is being used inside of the Java language tooling for Visual Studio Code. You will not see it really, because it all runs behind the scenes using the concept called language servers. But from the user's point of view, from the developer's point of view, hacking on projects, you'll not really see anything from that. It will just surface as great language tooling for Java in Visual Studio Code. And the second part that, of course, I need to recommend, and I would like to recommend, is the Spring extension pack, which gives you these additional integrations for Springy stuff and makes it easier for you to work on Spring projects, like the integration for start.spring.io, super fast navigation with these symbols, where you can get an overview about request mappings and beans and functions and all the stuff that you have from the Springy perspective in your project. There's, of course, additional code completion and content assist for working on property files, Spring Boot property files, and additional code snippets and additional refactorings that will come into play, especially in the future, in the next versions. You've seen the live hovers showing the live information from the running app. So those are kind of all the things that come with the Spring extension pack for Visual Studio Code, of course. If you look at the Spring tools themselves, they're of course not only available for Visual Studio Code, but as a nice side effect of this new architecture of Visual Studio Code, these Visual Studio Code extensions can also be consumed by other development environments. Visual Studio Code, of course, locally. We've seen they work in Codespaces, they also work in GitPod, they also work in other environments that are built around the infrastructure and around the community of Visual Studio Code. And of course, the Spring tools are also available for the Eclipse IDE extension, but you probably know that. Not really related. If you have questions about the Spring tools specifically, a few links, not super important for the moment. And with that, I would like to kind of finish the formal presentation or the walkthrough and to give you an overview about how to get started with Spring and how to hack on Spring applications using Codespaces and especially dev containers. And if you have any questions, I would of course be more than happy to either read them out from the chat if you have questions, or if you would like to, I'm not sure if that's, I think it's possible to unmute yourself and just ask the question if you would like to. And I also invite my colleague Dave Sire, who's I think on the session as well, to jump in and add additional thoughts and ideas if you would like to. Dave, feel free. And with that, I would like to thank you all. Hope you enjoyed the session. And if you have questions, I'm around. Go for some questions. at Martin Lippert. Email is here, and I think I will put up the slides online as well. So if you would like to get the references and the URLs that I put into the slides, I think I will put them online on Speaker Deck shortly, and send out a link to that on Twitter as well. But I'm sure you will find that. Otherwise, send me a ping. I will point you to the resource.